What I love about this area of New York, really the extended Greenwich Village area, is that it has always been a place where creative ideas and protest came alive in New York's history. It's an area where many artists came initially to be able to think outside of the mainstream. It's an area that's had lots of protests. It's an area that continues to be the site of sort of contention with whatever mainstream thinking is going on. And for the LGBT movement, it's natural that Stonewall Inn, where the modern LGBT movement sort of gets its history of being a movement as opposed to just some organizations for lesbian and gay rights, is right in the middle of this area in Greenwich Village, because it was a place where many bars, many gathering places for people who were lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender could come together, and where also new ideas could come together. And so when the Stonewall uprising happened and the police tried to raid the Stonewall, people in the neighborhood came to defend the people who at the inn. And I think this is kind of the history of the area. When I moved here for a little bit in the 70s, it had been a protest about the Women's Detention Center, which had also become an object of talking about criminalization and detention and jails. It's been a location of demonstrations against the efforts of Robert Moses to destroy Greenwich Village and make this into a superhighway. It's kind of a place where people think activism is a part of public life. And I've always felt that was part of living here. Anytime something terrible happens in the country, you feel like you can go to Union Square or Washington Square Park and find people who have a common sense of outrage about what's just happened. So I remember going to the park when there were major moments of feeling of we have to be visible, we have to say something. I'm trying to think of a specific example. In the early 2000s, particularly around the Iraq War, particularly around some of the protests around torture and detention of people, it's been a major source of that. It's also been a place where suffragists protested a century ago, and where women's rights demonstrations have been held. Some of the early protests, for example, when Roe v. Wade was overturned by the Supreme Court, you knew immediately that if you went to Washington Square Park, there would be people talking about it, there would be protests about it. So in that sense, it's kind of the neighborhood gathering place, and often marches, particularly in the LGBT and women's movement and civil rights movement, have ended at Washington Square Park with rallies, and everyone marches down Fifth Avenue to Washington Square, and then you have a big rally, and that's a very common route, particularly for the smaller marches until they become big issues. I feel like this neighborhood is one where whenever there's been an issue, whether it was the Iraq War and the protests against that, I remember the massive protest in New York, and that started first in places like Washington Square Park, where people gathered, and then became the massive global protests that it did. And demonstrations in Washington Square Park are often the place where new ideas first get heard, soapbox style, people talking about it. My own involvement really has been as a demonstrator, a person joining those things, particularly the lesbian and gay movement started its marches, the Pride marches. They started in the village. They started as people from the village who were in the LGBTQ plus movement, moving into the rest of the city. I've been a part of many of those demonstrations against war, demonstrations against city policies. It's just a very lively location for civic discourse.